Hello, everybody. I'm Charlie Faulkner, and
And
with me, and
I'm
who,
Nicholas Mostyn.
and we're not Helena Kennedy, our inveterate co podcast, is not with us today, and that's because we're doing it on an emergency basis because we think we should respond to the events of the trial, which was called The King versus Sergeant Martin Blake, and that trial was the trial where a man called Mr. Christopher Kaba was killed by uh, an, an armed forces an armed police officer in South London who killed him by shooting him in the head with one shot. Now, I think that case raises a number of questions. And the first is, should there be special treatment for the police? Now, I don't want to go too much into the detail, but basically, Sergeant Blake, who fired the shot that killed Sergeant Kaba, his defense to the jury was he believed he and his fellow officers were in danger from a car that was ramming police cars, and he shot Mr. Kaba in order to prevent Kaba, through ramming the cars, doing serious harm or even killing himself or one of his fellow officers. The first question is there a special rule for the police when they are engaged in that sort of operation? Now, Nicholas, I think the House of Lords have answered that question. And when I say the
They
House of Lords,
did,
I don't
they
mean
did, they did.
a court.
Before I just deal with that, I'll just be very quickly to say, for a long time, the law has allowed reasonable force to be used in self-defense or in the prevention of crime. So either in defending yourself or in defending other people. And this principle can be traced back a long way. So there was a big royal commission in 1879. I think Sir James Stevens was on it when he said the force used should not be disproportionate to the injury or mischief which it is intended to prevent. So there's been this iron rule that it has to be proportionate, and you have to know that it's proportionate. You have to honestly believe that the force you're meting out is proportionate, and it has to actually be proportionate. That is the rule. However, when self-defense is raised, the prosecution have to prove all the relevant elements. But the question you ask, is there special treatment? And the answer, the House of Lords answered that in the case of Lee Clegg. Do you remember him,
I,
Private Lee Clegg?
he
In
wasn't
19,
wasn't a police officer, wasn't he? A member of the security forces in Northern Ireland.
He was a member of the parachute regiment, and he fired at a passing car 4 shots. The first three were held to be in self-defense, but the car was well on its way by the time he fired the fourth, and he killed a woman in there called Karen Riley, and he was tried for murder and found guilty. And the House of Lords said that that his self-defense failed, self-defense defense failed, and and he was found guilty of murder. It said it makes no difference. They said that the person using the force was a policeman or a soldier acting in the course of his duty. That's what they said. Although I would suggest that in the real world, it's likely to make a very great difference in the way a defense is presented to and treated by a jury, I would
And
suggest.
I completely agree with that. And plainly, a jury is like to be much more sympathetic to a police officer in the heat of the moment, in an instant like that, dealing with somebody who will not stop and is trying to ram their way out of a roadblock. It's much more understandable that a police officer might feel that his life and the life of his fellow officers was under threat. But that is the factual situation rather than a special rule of law. And again, I think probably the law is right to say no special rule of law for police officers or members of the security services. Instead, they've got to comply with the ordinary law. They've got the defense of self-defense. The facts may favor them in individual occasions, but the basis of the law is the same. And that seems to me to be right.
Yes, it is right, and I think that it would command public support to think that there wasn't any special treatment for the police in law, although on the ground and in fact and in the real world, I mean, for the reasons that you've given, there is likely to be a great difference between the treatment of a self-defense claim by an armed police officer and self-defense claim people having an affray outside a pub.
But I agree with that. I mean, but presumably this places a really special burden on the Crown Prosecution Service when they're dealing with cases like this. I mean, it will have. Sergeant Blake was acquitted uh,
Yes.
after a 3 hour consideration by the jury. But should he have gone through this in the first place? What do you think, Nicholas?
Should he have been charged with murder? Well, the House of Lords said in the Clegg case that the law ought to be changed to allow some lesser charges to be made, but and they recommended it should be happen, but it hasn't.
Well, I mean, there you could be charged with manslaughter, because if somebody is killed as a result of the gross negligence of somebody, that could be a reason for charging them with manslaughter. But that's not available in this case, is it? Because he obviously intended to cause Kaba serious harm, and that's enough for the mens rea for murder, isn't it?
It is. There was the actus reus of murder, and there was the mens rea. The only question was the killing unlawful? And all the elements otherwise for murder. And that's exactly what the House of Lords said. They said in Private Clegg's case that having been decided that it wasn't self-defense wasn't available for the fourth shot, his entire offence dissolved, and he had to be found guilty of murder, not of manslaughter. That's what they said.
So,
and they pointed to the fact that other countries have allowed manslaughter to be done as a lesser verdict in those circumstances, but that's not happened here.
But what that means legally, Nicholas, as I understand what you're saying, is if either the force used was excessive, and that's an objective question, or the defendant didn't honestly believe that he was using proportionate force, if either of those elements are, as it were, disproved by the prosecution, because the burden proves on.
No, the prosecution because the burden's on the prosecution. They have to prove both elements.
They've got to prove that the force used was excessive and the defendant believed it was excessive, which is a subjective question. So if they prove both of those, then there's no scope for gross negligence manslaughter.
No, because what happens is the defense disappears and you're just left with the elements of murder.
Okay, well,
you're left with the intention to kill or cause serious harm and death. So that's murder. Whether that should be the law in the case of when we're dealing with prevention of crime, is another matter. But that is what the law says.
Yeah, no, I tend to think the law is right in relation to that. But I'd have thought in very many cases the CPS will not wish to prosecute because they will take the view there's enough material on the basis of what they have seen to justify not prosecuting a police officer in those circumstances. And they would know very well that in very, very many cases, juries, quite understandably and legitimately, will be sympathetic to the plight of a police officer who's got to make an absolutely split second decision.
Yes, exactly. I mean, I don't know I don't know enough about criminal law about whether there was an unlawful discharge of a firearm could be charged or something like that. But I haven't looked that up. But there's no homicide. There's no homicide offence less than murder that could have been charged.
I get that, and everything depends on was excessive force used. Did the defendant believe that acting proportionately? I think at the end of the day, our system requires that the CPS be left to make these decisions, and they've got to do it on an objective basis. There does need to be safeguards in relation to this, and the major safeguard in these circumstances may well be that the CPS can, in cases that they think merit it, can bring murder charges, though one would expect it to be very, very exceptional. I don't want to comment because I don't know enough about this as to whether there were exceptional circumstances that justified it here. But it looks like, looking at the film, the question was raised, the jury considered it very conscientiously and came to what looks like the right decision.